U.S. Trotskyism, the French Turn in the United States, by Robert J. Alexander. The Workers' Party of the United States had hardly been formed when a deep schism developed. This division centered on the French Turn, or specifically on the possibility that the Workers' Party might seek to enter the U.S. Socialist Party. Both Cannon and Shachtman favored such a move when the opportunity presented itself, while the opposition was led principally by Hugo Euler. One second. And Thomas Stamm, both members of the political committee of the Workers' Party, and for a while by Muste, the party's national secretary. Early activities of the Workers' Party. In the meantime, the Workers' Party had gotten off to what appeared to be a very good start. Soon after it was established, National Chairman Cannon and National Secretary Muste took off across the country on an organizing tour. Cannon reported that, quote, "We were received with enthusiasm along the way. One could notice in the radical labor movement a general spirit of appreciation of the fact that a process of unification had begun after the long period of disintegration and splits," end quote. The Cannon-Muste tour lasted about 2 months. They traveled together through the East and Middle West, ending this phase of their trip in Minneapolis, where they received a particularly enthusiastic reception from the ex-Communist League of America. I think that's what it is, CLA? God damn it. Ex-CLA leaders in rank and file, still basking in the afterglow of their victories in the local labor movement. From Minneapolis, Cannon and Muste went in different directions. Muste heading south, Cannon proceeding on to California, where the Trotskyists were beginning to gain some strength. The Workers' Party also took some steps to try to take advantage of the momentum created by the unification of the CLA and the American Workers' Party to try to bring other Marxist-Leninist groups into their merged organization. To this end, they sent a letter signed by A.J. Muste to the U.S. Proletarian Party, pointing out the establishment of the Workers' Party and asking for a, quote, "serious objective discussion on this urgent question of further unification of the revolutionary forces, thus providing added impetus to the building of the new Revolutionary Party and the new International," end quote. The Proletarian Party was established 15 years before, when the Michigan organization, which had been part of the left wing of the Socialist Party, refused to join either of the two original communist groups, the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party, and remained independent. In proclaiming itself communist, supported the Soviet Union. Spacing out here. The Proletarian Party was established 15 years before, when the Michigan organization, which had been part of the left wing of the Socialist Party, refused to join either of the two original communist groups, the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party, and remained independent. The Proletarian Party proclaimed itself communist, supported the Soviet Union, but had certain peculiar ideas of its own which kept it separated from the rest of the radical movement. There is no evidence that it gave any more friendly reception to the overtures of the Workers' Party for unification than it had given to the Lovestonites' proposal a couple of years before. Meanwhile, the Workers' Party had announced a, quote, "program of action," end quote, soon after it was established. This called, among other things, for doubling the party membership within 6 months, raising a $5,000 quote, "party foundation fund," end quote, within 60 days, building the paid circulation of the New Militant to 10,000 and that of the party's, quote, theoretical, end quote, magazine, New International, to 6,000. They also proclaimed their intention to send district organizers to at least 5 parts of the country to, quote, organize a national party educational system, end quote, including the first semester of a residence school in New York, to publish one, quote, popular agitational pamphlet, end quote, each month, and to, quote, launch an organization of the left progressive wing in the trade unions, end quote. There is no question but that the Workers' Party's reach exceeded its grasp in this ambitious program, in spite of the initial enthusiasm which accompanied the establishment of the organization. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons why this was the case was the early onset of factional fighting within the party. The Olerite split. The French turn problem first came into the open at an active workers' conference of the Workers' Party held in Pittsburgh in March 1935. This was supposed to be a meeting of, quote, party activists, come to a central place to discuss practical work, report on experiences, get acquainted with one another, etc., end quote. However, those opposed to the French turn insisted on bringing up the issue at the meeting with strong support from Joseph Zach Kornfeder, a longtime Stalinist who had recently come over to the Trotskyists because of his opposition to Stalin's abandonment of the sectarianism of the Comintern's third period. Muste opposed the raising of political issues at the Active Workers' Conference and was supported by Cannon and Shachtman. Cannon noted that, quote, he pushed them back a little bit at Pittsburgh, but we settled nothing, end quote. The next serious quarrel over the French turn issue came at the June 1935 plenum of the Workers' Party. At that meeting, Muste aligned himself with Euler and Martin Aburn, who opposed the idea of entering the Socialist Party. They sought firm commitment of the Workers' Party against the French turn in principle and against entry into the U.S. Socialist Party in particular. In contrast, the Cannon-Shachtman group urged, quote, major attention to the left wing and all developments in the Socialist Party, end quote. However, given the fact that the Trotskyists could not have been admitted to the Socialist Party at that moment, even if they had unanimously favored the idea, since the Socialists would not have admitted them, the Cannon-Shachtman position had in practice to be somewhat equivocal. James Cannon has noted that he and Shachtman suggested that the Workers' Party's emphasis on events in the Socialist Party be expressed in 3 ways. Quote, 1. By numerous articles in our press analyzing developments in the Socialist Party, addressing ourselves to the left-wing workers, offering them advice and criticism in a friendly way, ... 2. By instructing our members to establish personal contacts among the left socialists and try to get them interested in questions of principle, political discussions, joint meetings with us, etc. Form Trotskyist factions in the Socialist Party. 3. Form Trotskyist factions in the Socialist Party. Send in a group 30 or 40 members to join the Socialist Party and work inside it in the interests of the Bolshevik education of the left wing, end quote. The result of the June plenum were summed up by New Militant. An article entitled Plenum of NC of WP Spikes False Rumors began, quote, the June plenum of the National Committee of the Workers' Party took note of rumors to the effect that there are leaders and members of the Workers' Party who advocate that the Workers' Party should join or merge with the Socialist Party, end quote. It then went on in bold print to say, quote, "Occasionally it is necessary to take account of rumor and gossip, no matter how absurd and irresponsible it may be, simply because it is so persistent. Solely on this ground, the plenum hereby states that all such reports are absolutely without foundation, that no leaders or members of the Workers' Party advocate or have advocated any such program." End quote. The Shachtman group had a minority at the June 1935 plenum, but the factional struggle continued. The Oller Stamm group was by no means uninterested in the struggle then going on within the Socialist Party and the possibility that the Trotskyists could recruit substantial numbers of members as a result. However, Stamm and Uller's approach to the problem of recruiting within the Socialist Party was different from that of Cannon and Shachtman. The Uller Stamm group sought to bring substantial numbers of left-wing socialists out of their party, hopefully as an organized group which would merge with the Workers' Party. To this end, they entered into negotiations with a number of members of the far-left Revolutionary Policy Committee in the Socialist Party, looking toward a possible merger of that group with the Trotskyists. When Uller and Stamm reported these talks to the Political Committee of the Workers' Party, a negotiating committee was officially established, headed by Cannon, and from which Uller and Stamm were excluded. In due time, Uller and Stamm found that Cannon had not been urging the socialists to quit their party, but rather to continue to fight within it. So Uller and Stamm again made contact with the Revolutionary Policy Committee people, which led to nothing in terms of merger, but did result in Uller and Stamm being brought up on charges before the Control Commission of the Workers' Party. At that point, they were censored. The final showdown on this issue came at a new plenum in October 1935. There, a demand of the Uller-Stamm group that they be permitted to publish their own factional organ was rejected in a resolution written by Max Shachtman. The plenum also passed a motion by Muste, who had by then abandoned his alliance with Uller and Stamm, which gave Uller and Stamm a, quote, "stern warning to cease and desist from further violations of party discipline." They disregarded the warning and continued with systematic violations of party discipline, end quote, according to James Cannon, who added that, quote, "on that ground they were expelled from the party shortly after the October plenum," end quote. Later evolution of the Ullerites. Once out of the Workers' Party, the Uller-Stamm group established their own organization, the Revolutionary Workers League of the U.S. As the Trotskyists had been in, quote, opposition, end quote, to the official Communist Party, the Ullerites became a left-wing, quote, opposition, end quote, to the official Trotskyites, devoting most of their energies, at least in their early years, to trying to win converts from their ranks. Sidney Lenz has noted that at its inception, the Revolutionary Workers' League had about 200 members. Quote, "Clearly, the Revolutionary Workers' League misjudged its potential, yet it was made up of a remarkably competent group of people. Dozens of RWL members who later drifted away became immensely successful in the outside world. 2 became editors of Fortune magazine. My good friend Joe Fox became head of a large cafeteria union in New York. Another ex-comrade is still vice president of a national union with almost 500,000 members. A sympathizer from Southern Illinois who briefly joined the RWL became the secretary-treasurer of another good-sized national union. At least 6 became college professors, an equal number well-to-do businessmen, one a top civil servant in New York, ... end quote. For some time, the RWL was able to develop a modest base in the rapidly growing trade union movement. They were involved in organizing department store workers in New York, the unemployed in New Jersey, taxi drivers in Washington, D.C., and the auto workers in New York, where for some years an RWL member was head of Local 205 of the United Auto Workers. Sidney Lenz has noted that, quote, the RWL2 had a rank-and-file base from which to start, and we developed good personal relations with many of the non-communist officials in the United Auto Workers, men like Dick Frankenstein, a national vice president, ... end quote. However, as Lenz noted, the sectarianism of the Ullerites ultimately lost them whatever trade union influence they had acquired. Typical was the case described by Sidney Lenz of Local 205. He noted that, quote, the other side of this purist attitude was a growing tension between the Revolutionary Workers' League leadership, which insisted on further, quote, politicization, end quote, that is, raising the issue of a 6-hour workday, worker control of production, and so on, and Ziggy, end quote, the head of Local 205. Lenz added that, quote, a middle ground could have been found perhaps, but it wasn't, and the recriminations became ever larger until Ziggy resigned from the League, leaving us with nothing but a memory for our efforts, end quote. Among the principal figures in the League was Russell Blackwell, who went under the name of Rosario Negrete. When the Civil War broke out in Spain, the Ullerites decided to send Negrete to Spain. There he worked for some time with the left wing of the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, the PUM, the Party of Marxist Unification, and sent back glowing reports of his successes with them. As a result, Hugo Uller himself decided to go to Spain. Uller soon became disenchanted with the situation and started to return home. However, he was arrested by police controlled by the Communist Party and was allowed to leave Spain only after intervention by the U.S. Embassy. Negrete had an even harder time getting out of Spain, spending some time in a Spanish GPU dungeon. He too finally got out as the result of U.S. Embassy intervention. Folks, if you haven't already, you should check out the audiobook that's on YouTube of Homage to Catalonia by the great George Orwell. The Ullerites' position on the Spanish Civil War exemplifies their general orientation in their first years. At the time, the Socialist Party was trying to recruit volunteers to fight in the Loyalist Army in a so-called Debs column. The Revolutionary Workers' League issued a, quote, open letter to the Friends of the Debs column, end quote. In it, they stated that, quote, the column is going to defend at the same time the People's Front capitalist government, ... The Debs column, when it places itself at the disposal of the People's Front government, becomes a tool in the hands of one section of capitalism against another section, end quote. The letter ended with a series of slogans, all printed in capital letters, which demanded, quote, break with the socialist program and sponsorship, build a new Marxist party in Spain, create Soviets, nationalize industry and banks, workers' control of production, land to the peasants, etc., end quote. These indicated not only the extreme left position of the group, but also its ignorance of the real revolution which had occurred, bracket, under anarchist influence, end bracket, in Loyalist Spain, particularly in Catalonia and Aragon, in the early period of the Civil War. The Ullerites succeeded in getting together a species of international of their own. Quote, the International Contact Commission, end quote. It consisted not only of the Revolutionary Workers' League of the USA, but also of the Central Committee of the Red Front of Greater Germany and the Leninist League of Scotland. This commission issued a publication called International News. The Ullerites continued to maintain a Trotskyist position on most essential matters, including the question of the nature of the Soviet Union. At the time of the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Ullerites' newspaper, The Fighting Worker, declared that, quote, "the workers of the world must come to the aid of the Soviet Union in its revolutionary war of defense against imperialism and its fascist agents who hope to make a colony out of the Soviet Union," end quote. This same article speculated on the possibility of a, quote, "semi-truce," end quote, between Britain and Germany, and even that Britain, quote, "will even despite any promises come to the aid of Germany to accomplish the overthrow of the Soviet Union," end quote. The article observed that, quote, "it is now clear that the Red Army seizures of Baltic areas were defensive steps against an imperialist attack under German leadership," end quote. A month later, the Revolutionary Workers' League announced, in connection with the indictment of the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party, that it, quote, "has written to the SWP and offered its full support in this struggle," end quote. The announcement called for a, quote, "broad united front whose main task will be to mobilize the aggressive support of the broad masses," end quote. The Ullerites themselves were expecting to be persecuted by the Roosevelt administration, and they prepared to go underground. Sidney Lenz has noted that, quote, "we rented a room on Huron Street where we stored files. Uller moved to Denver where he kept his address a secret, even from me, and a couple of other comrades went into hiding for both personal and political reasons," end quote. Lenz added that, quote, "it was all unnecessary, however, for there were no arrests or convictions of radicals after Pearl Harbor. The only problem we in the Revolutionary Workers' League had to contend with was the periodic refusal of the post office to mail our paper, The Fighting Worker. Even that was rectified, however," end quote. The Ullerites continued in existence until some time after World War II. In their decade-long career, they suffered a number of splits. In 1938, Thomas Stamm, co-leader of the group, broke away to form a Revolutionary Workers' League of his own. The principal source of his dissidence, apparently, was a belief that the Ullerites were too much oriented toward being in opposition to the Trotskyists, centering their attention as a result on events in Europe and trying too little to get involved in problems and movements in the United States. The Stammites had small groups in Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and one or two other cities. In 1940, Stamm sought to bring together with his group some dissident Socialist Labor Party people as well as the Fieldites and others. When this move failed, his organization, known by then as the Revolt Group, went out of existence. An effort by Stamm and a handful of friends to negotiate conditions for re-entry into the Revolutionary Workers' League in 1946, in response to a, quote, "open letter to all revolutionists," end quote, by the Ullerites, failed. Another group to break away was a small element headed by George Marlin. They formed the Leninist League in 1937 and continued to exist until the early 1950s. According to Marlin, it successively gave up allegiance to Trotsky, Lenin, and finally Marx, from whom Marlin eventually came to regard as a, quote, "German nationalist and anti-Semite," end quote. Max Shachtman concluded concerning the Marlinites that, quote, "one must be a blood relation of the immediate family, or at least related to it by marriage in order to qualify for membership. This has the unfortunate effect of somewhat reducing the arena of recruitment, but it does guarantee against contamination," end quote. Others who broke away from the Ullerites to form small groups included Dave Atkins, who joined forces with a group of Italian Americans who were followers of Amadeo Bordiga, and Karl Mienov, who maintained that the Spanish Civil War was an imperialist struggle on both sides. The Atkins group continued for some time after World War II. The turn toward the Socialist Party. The culmination of Trotsky's French turn, insofar as the Trotskyists of the United States was concerned, was their entry into the Socialist Party in mid-1936. This did not take place without considerable travail on both sides. The Socialist Party had been experiencing increased convulsion and factionalism for about 4 years. The leadership... Son of a bitch. Sorry. The leadership, which had been running the party since the split with the communists in 1919-20, was challenged in the early 1930s by a group of younger men and women who differed with their elders on a number of issues. The, quote, militants, end quote, as the young left-wingers were called, were much more sympathetic to the Soviet Union than were the leaders of the old guard, who after the early 1920s had developed an unrelenting aversion to the USSR. Along with this more sympathetic view of the Soviet Union went a greater willingness on the part of the militants to engage in some kinds of joint activity with the official communists and the schismatic communist groups, including the Trotskyites. Another issue between the two socialist groups concerned the trade union movement. The militants were increasingly critical of the old-time socialist leaders in the garment trades and other unions, and at the same time were much more interested than the old guard in trying to gain influence among the many independent unions which arose outside the American Federation of Labor early in the New Deal. Finally, the militants and the old guard differed fundamentally, although this did not become completely clear until after the old guard left the party on the attitude to be assumed towards the New Deal. The militants saw their party as the left-wing opposition to the New Deal, while the old guard increasingly sought to become the left wing of the New Deal. The militants tended to rally around Norman Thomas, the only new figure of national importance to appear in the Socialist Party in the wake of the communist defections of the post-World War I period. Thomas was not basically concerned with the fine points of ideology and exegesis which the militants raised against the old guard, but Thomas was interested in trying to orient the party towards the major problems of the U.S. economy, society, and politics, an effort which he saw as being hampered by the innate caution and sometimes entrenched interest of the old guard. The conflict first reached national attention at the 1932 convention of the Socialist Party, at which Thomas and the militants sought to displace old guard leader Morris Hillquit as national Where the hell am I? As national chairman. Although this effort failed, the militant ranks grew rapidly thereafter, and an even further left group, the Revolutionary Policy Committee, appeared. In the 1934 convention of the party, a new Declaration of Principles, a confusing hodgepodge of revolutionary rhetoric and modifying reservations, was pushed through by the militants and the RPC. By late 1935, the conflict had come to the verge of split. Two rival organizations were established in New York City, the largest center of socialist membership, and in the spring of 1936 there were actually primary elections within the Socialist Party, then a, quote, legal, end quote, party in New York State, to choose delegates to the National Convention, elections won by the militants. Finally, at the Cleveland Convention in June 1936, the old guard walked out to form its own organization, the Social Democratic Federation. So long as serious efforts were being made to maintain the unity of the Socialist Party, the possibility of the Trotskyists being accepted in its midst was virtually non-existent. Although a few individual dissident communists, Herbert Zamm and Ben Gitlow, from the ranks of the Lovestone Knights, and Albert Goldman, a Trotskyist, were accepted as members, mass entry of the Trotskyists was impossible. Moreover, in the later phase of the militant old guard struggle, Norman Thomas developed the notion of the Socialist Party becoming a, quote, all-inclusive, end quote, party. The exact meaning of this was unclear, but it certainly involved the idea of welcoming those who had broken with the official communist movement and were willing to come into the Socialist Party to help build it into the major force in the left wing of U.S. politics. Although Thomas had probably not thought in terms of merging with whole organizations such as the Workers' Party, by the spring of 1936 he was willing to consider the idea, as were his militant associates. The radical new twist in the French turn met some resistance within the Workers' Party. Even after the exit of the Ullerites, a group in the Workers' Party leadership strongly opposed entry into the Socialist Party. This was particularly true of A.J. Muste and others from the old American Workers' Party. By the time of the merger of the American Workers' Party and the Communist League, Trotsky had already called for ending the French turn in France, and the AW peers then expressed their opposition to any merger with the Socialist Party in the United States. They wangled an agreement from the Trotskyists to concentrate efforts on building up the Workers' Party as an alternative to both the Socialist and Communist parties, and that no move would be taken to liquidate the Workers' Party into the Socialist Party. The Mustites in the Workers' Party were supported by an older Trotskyist element headed by Martin Aburn and others. Although there was considerable internal debate in the Workers' Party, the faction favoring entry into the Socialist Party, led by James Cannon and Max Shachtman, gradually gained ground. For one thing, Trotsky favored the step, although it is not clear that he, quote, ordered, end quote, it. Shachtman insisted later that Trotsky approved the entry into the SP once it had occurred, but did not direct that his followers take the step. On the other hand, Muste insisted that Aburn had received a cable from Trotsky while the debate was still underway, indicating that entry into the Socialist Party was in conformity with the international Trotskyist line. It is clear that letters were exchanged by Cannon and Shachtman with Trotsky before the decision to enter the Socialist Party was taken. Cannon and Shachtman warned that without Trotskyites being in their ranks after the split with the old guard, quote, there is not merely a potential but a very real danger that the bulk of the leftward movement in the Socialist Party would be swallowed up and consequently vitiated and destroyed by Stalinists, end quote. M.S. Venkataramani has paraphrased other arguments by Cannon and Shachtman in their correspondence with Trotsky. Quote, once inside the Socialist Party, Cannon and Shachtman asserted the Trotskyists had nothing much to worry about. Their trained and resolute cadres were more than a match for the so-called militants. With the exit of the old guard, the SP bureaucracy would be weak and inexperienced. The party's loose structure would enable the Trotskyists to maintain their own publications and thus carry on their propaganda without a break, and indeed to a much larger audience. In many states and cities, the Socialist Party was so inadequately organized that the Trotskyists would become the Socialist Party as far as those areas were concerned, end quote. Trotsky finally sent a cable to Rose Karsner, Cannon's companion, on January 24th, 1936, quote, personally in favor of entry, Leo, end quote. He followed the detailed instructions to the American Trotskyist leaders, warning them to work cautiously once they were in the Socialist Party, and to get very much involved in the Socialist Party's organization and campaigns. Trotsky warned that, quote, the greatest endurance, a calm, friendly tone is indispensable. Naturally, the tone can and will change when you already have the necessary points of support and when big political questions come upon the order of the day, end quote. A Workers' Party convention in March 1936 finally decided in favor of entry into the socialist ranks. Cannon later commented that, quote, the minority, which was a very small minority by then, accepted the decision. There was nothing else they could do, end quote. Meanwhile, negotiations had been underway between the Trotskyists and leaders of the Socialist Party. Herbert Zahm, an ex-Lovestoneite who had entered the Socialist Party some time before, played a key role in establishing these contacts. Herbert Zahm aided Cannon in arranging meetings with a number of militant leaders, including Gus Tyler, Murray Barron, Andrew B. Miller, and Paul Porter. Sidney Hook was the principal intermediary in arranging a meeting between the Trotskyist leaders and Norman Thomas. In his own discussions with Thomas, Hook apparently laid particular stress on the importance of a group of intellectuals in the Trotskyist periphery, including Louis Hacker, Charles Yale Harrison, Max Eastman, John Dos Passos, and Lionel Trilling, who would be attracted to the Socialist Party if it were to admit the Trotskyists. In retrospect, Thomas was to admit that the most serious single political mistake he made as leader of the Socialist Party was to support the admission of the Trotskyists to its ranks. However, in the months before it happened, Thomas favored the move. In February 1936, Thomas wrote Arthur McDowell, then State Secretary of the Illinois Socialist Party, quote, as for the Workers' Party, I should like most of them in as individuals. I think they would strengthen us in Minneapolis, but we in New York are very much afraid of taking them as a group with their loyalty to Trotsky and to the Trotskyite organization, their genius for controversy and faction, and their bitter opposition to other groups. If they'd come as individuals, it would be another matter, end quote. Thomas. In June, Thomas wrote a group of Pennsylvania socialists that, quote, if some former members of the Workers' Party will accept ... the Socialist Declaration of Principles, the Socialist Platform, the Socialist Constitution, the Socialist Discipline ... honestly, it seems to me in this crisis we have room for them. But I have warned our comrades in New York to be cautious and careful in their examination of each individual and in deciding whether or not to receive them into the party, end quote. Actual negotiations for entry of the Workers' Party members into the Socialist Party were conducted between Cannon and Shachtman on the one hand and Norman Thomas on the other. Details were then negotiated between the two Trotskyist leaders and Jack Altman, Herbert Zahm, and Gus Tyler for the Socialist Party. These negotiations were, were all, quote, informal, end quote, in the sense that, at least on the Socialist Party side, they were never officially authorized by the National Executive Committee or any other official body. Max Shachtman has suggested that the reason for this somewhat peculiar method of negotiation was the desire of the socialists not to recognize the Workers' Party as a group of equal status to the Socialist Party, and fear that a formal fusion of the two parties might alienate many socialist members and sympathizers. In any case, the Trotskyists had to pay a considerable price, at least temporarily, for their admission. It was decided that the Workers' Party would dissolve as a separate organization and that its periodicals, the New Militant and New International, would cease publication, and that the members of the Workers' Party would be accepted, quote, as individuals, end quote, into the various branches and locals of the Socialist Party. As a consequence, the last issue of the New Militant as the organ of the Workers' Party was published in June 1936. The New Militant announced the Workers' Party's dissolution and the entry of its members into the Socialist Party and proclaimed, quote, "We enter the Socialist Party as we are, with our ideas," end quote. The Trotskyists in the Socialist Party. There is no doubt that the Trotskyists went into the Socialist Party in 1936 with the intention of capturing it if they could, or leaving it again with as many new recruits as possible. They certainly had no intention of really dissolving their organization in the socialist ranks. The political bureau of the Workers' Party continued to meet in New York City each Monday night to plan the strategy within the Socialist Party. In the individual branches and locals of the Socialist Party, the Trotskyites threw themselves energetically into socialist activities. There was some disagreement among ex-members of the Workers' Party as to just what their roles should be within the Socialist Party. Some of them, like Albert Glotzer, who had at first opposed entry into the Socialist Party, felt that once inside socialist ranks they should get as deeply involved as possible in day-to-day work rather than concentrating on factional activity. At one point, Glotzer went to Mexico to confer with Trotsky on this issue. However, he found that although Trotsky was upset by the way his followers were behaving, his concern was the reverse of Glotzer's. He was afraid that they were becoming so involved in the Socialist Party that they were in danger of losing their separate identity. At the other extreme to Glotzer was A.J. Muste, who, like Glotzer, had originally opposed entry into the Socialist Party. Muste continued to think it was a bad idea. In June 1936, when Trotsky was still living in Norway, Muste made a trip to Europe where he spent a week with Trotsky. Trotsky tried unsuccessfully to convince Muste of the validity of the French term. Muste then went to Holland and Belgium, where he conferred with Trotskyist leaders, and in July he attended an international Trotskyist meeting in Paris where breaking up the socialist parties and taking their militants who would constitute the new Revolutionary International were extensively discussed. This meeting completely alienated Muste from Trotskyism, and when he returned home he again became a Presbyterian minister and abandoned partisan political activity. The Trotskyists were not entirely happy with the kind of reception they received from the Socialist Party's leaders when they joined the Socialist Party. The Trotskyists felt they, quote, weren't treated as equals, end quote, and they particularly resented not being invited to join the editorial boards of the Socialist Call and other party publications. The Trotskyists had considerable success in winning control of local and state organizations of the Socialist Party. In Minnesota, where they had one of their principal centers of strength and the Socialists had only a small organization, the Trotskyists immediately took control of the Socialist Party in Minneapolis and in the state. In the 1936 election, Vincent Dunn, the Trotskyist leader, was the only statewide socialist candidate running for Secretary of State. The Minnesota Socialist Platform proclaimed that the socialists were not running a full slate against the Farmer Labor Party, FLP, but were running Dunn so that workers who voted for the Farmer Labor Party to keep out the Republicans and Democrats, quote, can register their vote for the Socialist Party of Minnesota, end quote, and added that, quote, only a revolutionary socialist party can in reality champion the immediate and ultimate needs of the toilers, end quote. The Trotskyists also did well in Chicago, where the socialists were also weak in 1936. The ex-Workers' Party people had a majority or close to it in the socialist ranks once they joined them. For all practical purposes, the Trotskyist youth became the Young People's Socialist League in Chicago. Albert Glotzer and other Trotskyists were soon elected to the party's city committee. Chicago was important to the Trotskyists for another reason. There, Albert Goldman, a Trotskyist who had entered the Socialist Party shortly before the Workers' Party was formed, had established a mimeographed bulletin, Socialist Appeal, which was an official publication of the Socialist Party of Illinois before entry of the Workers' Party people. Cannon noted that, quote, as soon as our party became oriented toward entry into the Socialist Party, we reestablished collaboration so effectively that when we gave up our press in response to the demand of the leaders of the Socialist Party, we already had an agreement with Goldman that the Socialist Appeal ... would become an official organ of the Trotskyist faction, end quote. Another center of major Trotskyist infiltration was California. The heads of the Socialist Party in California, Glenn and Carrie Trimble, were sympathetic to the Trotskyists, who were reinforced soon after they entered the Socialist Party by Cannon, who moved to California, quote, for his health, end quote. By the end of 1936, the State Socialist Party had launched a weekly newspaper, Labor Action, with Cannon as editor. Several years later, Cannon wrote that, quote, Labor Action was published under the auspices of the Socialist Party of California, but it was not a Trotskyist but if it was not a Trotskyist agitational paper, I will never be able to make one. We tried our best to utilize it in that sense, end quote. In February 1937, the Trotskyists openly reorganized as a faction of the Socialist Party. This action took place at a National Socialist Appeal Conference in Chicago. Cannon wrote that, quote, Socialist Party members were invited from all parts of the country to come to Chicago to discuss ways and means of advancing the interests of the party. Everybody was welcome regardless of his background or his factional alignment. The sole condition was that he agree with the program of the Socialist Appeal, which happened to coincide with the program of the Fourth International, ... On that basis and in that form, we constituted in Chicago in the early winter of 1937 what amounted in effect to a new nationwide left wing in the Socialist Party, end quote. Frank Trager, the National Labor Secretary of the Socialist Party and a member of the Clarity Caucus faction, wrote Norman Thomas that some 100 people were present at the appeal conference, about 25% of whom had not belonged to the Workers' Party. Of the resolutions passed at the conference, Trager noted that, quote, we would agree with very few of them, end quote. Cannon argued that aside from gaining a substantial number of new members, the Trotskyists made their three major gains by their passage through the Socialist Party. First, wide support for the Trotskyist Defense Committee was mobilized to counter charges made against Trotsky during the Moscow trials. As Cannon put it, quote, we were then in the most favorable situation as members of the Socialist Party and therefore surrounded to a certain extent with the protective collaboration of a halfway respectable party, and we couldn't be isolated as a small group of, quote, Trotskyists, end quote, ... end quote. The Socialist Call, official organ of the Socialist Party, noted formation of the American Committee for the Defense of Léon Trotsky in November 1936. It listed, quote, among the membership, end quote, of the group Norman Thomas, John Dewey, Freda Kirchway, Susan Le Follette, Devere Allen, Edmund Wilson, Louis Adamic, Professor E.A. Ross, Joseph Wood Crutch, H.M. Callan, James T. Farrell, Professor William H. Kilpatrick, Max Eastman, Sidney Hook, Inez Haynes Irwin, James Rorty, Professor Paul Brissenden, Vincent R. Dunn, John Chamberlain, Benjamin Stolberg, and Louis Hacker. Quote, natives, end quote, as the Trotskyists called those who belonged to the Socialist Party before they joined it, helped extensively in this campaign. Norman Thomas spoke at one of its major meetings in Chicago, while Roy Burt, National Secretary of the party, spoke along with Max Shachtman in New York City. The Socialist Party also published a pamphlet by Francis Heisler, a Trotskyist, on the issue. Another advantage Cannon saw in Trotskyist membership was the Trotskyist ability to push their point of view on the Spanish Civil War. Cannon wrote that, quote, "We fought to clarify the affairs taking place in Spain and to educate the cadres of the American Party on the meaning of those events. Our entry into the Socialist Party facilitated this campaign, gave us an audience right at hand inside of what was then our own party," end quote. Finally, membership in the Socialist Party helped the Trotskyists to establish contacts with the labor movement. Cannon noted that they were able particularly to establish contacts and a modicum of influence among the maritime workers of California, where they organized, quote, "the first nucleus of a Trotskyist faction," end quote, and among the auto workers, quote, where up to then we had never anything more than an occasional contact, end quote. The Stalinists and the French term. The Stalinists commented extensively and vituperatively about the presence of the Trotskyists in the Socialist Party. They wept many crocodile tears, quote, warning, end quote, the Socialists of the dire consequences which would result from their association with people whom Earl Browder, in a speech at Madison Square Garden, called, quote, "the first-line attack of fascism among the masses," end quote. Typical of the line of attack of the official communists during this period was an article by Clarence Hathaway entitled, quote, "Trotskyism in the United States," end quote, which appeared in The Communist in March 1937. He wrote that, quote, "with Trotsky carrying on his poisonous propaganda freely from Mexico and giving guidance to his followers here, now firmly entrenched in the Socialist Party, much harm is being done to the Socialist Party itself and through it to the whole labor movement. Trotskyism has become a serious menace against which the whole labor movement and in the first place the Socialists must be alarmed," end quote. Hathaway also had some friendly advice for the Socialists, quote, "Though most of the Socialist members are not Trotskyists and even opposed to Trotskyism, they are without inner organization for the defense of the party and without courageous leaders who will boldly take up the fight for socialism and against counter-revolution. The result has been disastrous for the party. The party has been thrown into a deep crisis that will be fatal unless the poisonous cancer of Trotskyism is cut clearly at the coming socialist convention," end quote. Furthermore, the Daily Worker editor claimed the Socialist Party itself was being, quote, "infected," end quote, by Trotskyism. He claimed that, quote, "already one sees Norman Thomas and other leaders defending Trotskyism, excusing the assassins of Kirov, defending the confused allies of fascism, joining with Trotsky in attacking the Soviet Union," end quote. Hathaway professed to see even the nature of Thomas's 1936 presidential campaign, in which he had run as a left opponent of the New Deal when the communists were in effect supporting Roosevelt, as a result of Trotskyist influence. Quote, "The narrow sectarian policy foisted on the Socialist Party during the election campaign undoubtedly reflected Trotskyist influence, resulted in discrediting the party among the broad masses of workers," end quote. With touching, quote, solicitude, end quote, for the Socialists' dire fate, Hathaway noted once more, quote, "Our advice went in the most comradely way. We warned them against the Trotskyists," end quote, adding that, quote, "Trotskyism has nothing in common with socialism and has no place in the socialist ranks," end quote. Hathaway's peroration was typical of the Stalinist diatribes against the Trotskyists. Quote, "The Trotskyists must be driven out. There is no room for scab splitters and assassins in the labor movement. The People's Front, the Farmer Labor Party, uniting all workers and honest progressives, must be pushed forward with ever greater vigor as the weapon of the masses against reaction and its Trotskyist agents, end quote. Growing resistance to Trotskyists in the Socialist Party. The, quote, natives, end quote, in the Socialist Party grew increasingly restive with the presence of the Trotskyists in their midst. However, it was about a year before they mobilized to take definitive action to get rid of the Russian leader's supporters. After the defection of the old guard, the militants split into two rival groups. The more moderate element continued to call itself the Militants, and it was in control of the party in New York City. The other element, known as the Clarity Caucus or Zahm-Tyler Caucus, after its leaders Herbert Zahm and Gus Tyler, dominated the National Party organization and was the only element confronting the Trotskyists in the Young People's Socialist League. Norman Thomas tended to be more closely associated with the militants than with the Clarityites. The militants and the Clarityites differed for several months on the tactics to be used to confront the Trotskyists. The militants were convinced much earlier than the Clarityites that it was necessary to get rid of Trotsky's followers. The Zahm-Tyler caucus tried longer to combat them, though through presenting an alternative left-wing program rather than by taking measures to exclude them from the party. Quote, native, end quote, socialist leaders in various parts of the country soon began to organize to seek the expulsion of the Trotskyists. Jack Altman, New York City leader of the militants, DeVere Allen, leader of the Socialist Party in Connecticut, and Paul Porter in Milwaukee were among these. Allen and Porter established a committee of correspondence to organize the campaign. Norman Thomas early became concerned with the impact of the Trotskyists on the Socialist Party. The evolution of his attitude reflects that of many of the, quote, natives, end quote. In a memorandum he directed to militant leaders Max Delson, Murray Gross, Murray Barron, Hal Siegel, and Jack Altman as early as August 1936, he asked, quote, how are we going to keep our very definite and constructive line and avoid a dangerous isolationism such as that into which the Trotskyists fell and into which I fear they may lead us, end quote. He expressed particular concern about the YPSL, saying, quote, they are giving the impression of being hard to get along with and of being pure and simple Trotskyists. I don't want to exclude them as Trotskyists, but they ought not to exclude some of us who are not Trotskyites, end quote. By December 1936, Thomas was writing California Socialist Party Secretary Glenn Trimble about a leaflet on the Spanish Civil War published by that unit. Quote, I meant to say that the tone of the leaflet was Trotskyist and was hurtful, ... I know the immense harm that can be done, ... by public abuse, or what looks like public abuse, of the leaders in a cause that we must support, end quote. In January 1937, Thomas wrote David Lasser, socialist head of the unemployed workers' organization, the Workers' Alliance, of his opposition to those in the Socialist Party who, quote, let the Communist Party make its decisions for it simply by opposing everything the Communist Party favors. This tendency, to some extent correctly, is attributed to Trotskyist elements in the party, end quote. By early February 1937, Thomas was asking Clarityite Lillian Symes for her opinion of the condition created by the Trotskyists in California and requested a confidential report on the matter. About the same time, he wrote Paul Porter in Wisconsin for his opinion on the way the Trotskyists were behaving in neighboring Minnesota. In response to Thomas's letter, Lillian Symes sent a warning, quote, you are being counted upon to maintain an all-inclusive, end quote, party in which the WPers can function as a unit without national discipline until they gain control. Then they will introduce, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, and crack down on you and all other dissenters without mercy. As Jim Cannon put it to us, quote, Hone will save our necks for us. The national office can't crack down on us without antagonizing Hone. Give us another year in which to work freely, and Thomas will be in the impossible position." End quote. Daniel Hone was the socialist mayor of Milwaukee. In a move to curb the factionalism threatening to tear the Socialist Party apart, the, quote, natives, end quote, supported the call of a special national convention in March 1937. Fearing that this might result in moves to expel them, the Trotskyists sought to head off this eventuality. Cannon later wrote that, quote, "We felt that we hadn't yet had time enough to educate and win over the maximum number of socialist workers and socialist youth who were capable of becoming revolutionists. We needed about 6 months more time. Therefore, our strategy was to delay the showdown at this convention," end quote. They sought a pre-convention meeting with Thomas and leaders of the militant and Clarity factions. As a result, Cannon and Vincent Dunne of Minneapolis were appointed to speak for the Trotskyists, and they held a series of meetings in New York, including one at Thomas's home, with Thomas, Gus Tyler, Jack Altman, and Murray Barron. Cannon subsequently claimed that Thomas, quote, "solemnly agreed with us there was no proposal," Thomas, quote, "solemnly agreed with us there that no proposal should be made at the convention to suppress internal organs, the socialist appeal in particular, or to expel anybody for his opinions. Norman Thomas made the agreement, but he didn't keep it," end quote. The ex-Workers' Party members were not eligible for election to the March 1937 convention since they had not been members of the Socialist Party long enough. However, quote, natives, end quote, who belonged to the Socialist Appeal Caucus had substantial representation. In the face of the move to ban factional publications, which in effect meant those of the Trotskyists, many of the delegates wanted immediately to split the Socialist Party. However, the ex-Workers' Party leaders convinced them not to do so at that time. The March 1937 convention presented the Trotskyists with difficult decisions. Cannon wrote that, quote, "For the second time we were deprived of our press. We still hesitated to bring things to a head because in addition to our general unreadiness, the work of the Trotsky Defense Committee was still uncompleted, and we were afraid of jeopardizing it by a premature split," end quote. There were extensive discussions within the Trotskyist ranks. Both Cannon and Shachtman addressed a left-wing caucus in New York where they stressed the slogan, quote, "deeper into the Socialist Party," end quote. Shachtman was sanguine at the time about the Trotskyists' ability to take over the Socialist Party if they could stay in it some time longer. The Trotskyists continued to carry on their factional struggle even though deprived of their publications. Cannon described their tactics, quote, "We work out a system of multi-copied personal letters and branch resolutions. An ostensibly personal letter evaluating the convention was signed by one comrade and addressed to another. The letter was then mimeographed and discreetly distributed in the branches. Every time an issue arose, ... a resolution would be introduced in a New York branch by an individual comrade, then mimeographed and sent to our faction groups all over the country as a basis for their own resolutions on the question," end quote. An issue which helped trigger the move to expel the Trotskyists arose in New York City. The majority of the, quote, natives, end quote, there decided not to run a candidate against Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who was running for re-election in the 1937 election. At a city membership meeting where the issue was debated, Thomas argued in favor of his policy while Shachtman was its principal opponent. Soon after, Trotsky intervened, telling the American Trotskyists that he thought they had gotten everything from the Socialist Party that they could and that they should withdraw. They had begun to reach this conclusion themselves. Trotsky argued that they were bound by Socialist Party discipline so long as they stayed in the Socialist Party and so were hampered in their propaganda activities and therefore should get out. One important factor which certainly influenced the thinking of both Trotsky and his U.S. followers was the presence of the Trotskyists in the Socialist Party had largely served its purpose insofar as giving, quote, protective covering, end quote, for the Trotskyist Defense Committee was concerned. For 7 days, beginning on April 10, 1937, the Commission of Inquiry, headed by John Dewey, held its sessions in Mexico City, taking Trotsky's testimony, and he and the American Trotskyist leaders were equally sure that the resulting report of the Commission would vindicate Trotsky and declare Trotsky innocent of the charges made against him at the first Moscow trial and in accompanying Stalinist propaganda. In any case, by June, Trotsky was urging his U.S. followers in the strongest terms to carry out a split in the Socialist Party. Trotsky wrote James Burnham, Cannon, Albert Glotzer, and Weber on June 15, 1937 that, quote, "The coincidence of all these factors promises to open an extremely favorable situation for our activity during the coming fall. It would be criminal to meet this new situation as prisoners of Thomas, Trager, Tyler, and Co." So we must again appear on the scene as an independent party. It seems to me here that the anniversary of the October Revolution is the deadline for the establishment of our complete political independence, end quote. Trotsky. Some of the Trotskyist leaders, quote, thought that this new course recommended by Trotsky was wrong, end quote. They included Max Shachtman, James Burnham, Arne Swabik, who were all then in New York. Cannon, who was living and working in California, immediately accepted Trotsky's position. After negotiations between the two groups, it was agreed that they would be, quote, oriented toward a split, end quote. Formation of the Socialist Workers' Party. While pressure for expelling the Trotskyists from the Socialist Party was mounting among the, quote, natives, end quote, upon returning from a 2-month trip to Europe in July 1937, Norman Thomas reached the conclusion that the party had to get rid of the Trotskyists. Norman Thomas wrote a letter late that month to a number of people who had written him about the Trotskyist problem. Quote, "Trotskyism in the sense of supreme loyalty to a group or cause outside the Socialist Party is today our primary trouble. While we have it in the party, we cannot come effectively to grips with other problems, ... I know that we shall not have a socialist party at all unless very soon we can find ways of ridding ourselves of those who use the Socialist Party for essentially communist ends and whose real allegiance is outside the party, to Stalin, to Trotsky, or to groups connected with Stalin or Trotsky. The issue is loyalty, and that we must have even at the cost of temporary reduction in our numbers," end quote. Norman Thomas. Probably as a result of Trotsky's instructions, the Trotskyists in the Socialist Party provoked their own expulsion. They began openly to circulate the bulletin of the Fourth International Preparatory Group to express their support for establishment of the Fourth International. In late July, they held a, quote, plenum, end quote, of the appeal tendency and reportedly, quote, discussed methods, time, and procedure of disaffiliating from the Socialist Party, end quote. As a result, on July 26, 1937, the City Executive Committee of local New York of the Socialist Party voted 9-2 with one abstention to prefer charges, quote, for carrying on an organized conspiracy to violate discipline of the Socialist Party, end quote, against the principal appeal tendency leaders in New York City, citing these and other actions against them. On August 9, 1937, the City Central Committee of local New York took action on these charges, expelling 52 leading members of the appeal faction. The vote was 48-2, with 18 people not voting, and it was taken after 4 hours of discussion. Those expelled included people who had entered from the Workers' Party, including Shachtman, Martin Aburn, James Burnham, Emmanuel Garrett, Emmanuel Geltman, Felix Morrow, Ernest McKinney, George Novak, and John G. Wright. They also included a number of, quote, native, end quote, socialists such as Alex Retskin, Christian Nielsen, and Hal Draper. These expulsions were only the beginning of the exit of the Trotskyists from the Socialist Party. Shortly afterward, Cannon was reported to have told the National Executive Committee of the Socialist Party that, quote, "We got what we wanted out of joining the party for a while. Our aims were accomplished, and now goodbye. We're going to take with us a lot of your folks," end quote. At the April 1938 National Convention of the Socialist Party, the National Secretary reported that the state charters of the socialist organizations of California, Indiana, Ohio, Minnesota had been revoked to prevent the Trotskyists from taking them out of the party. Cannon claimed that by the time the purging of the Trotskyists was completed, the Trotsky movement in the United States had more than twice as many members as it had before entering the Socialist Party. Right after the expulsion, the Trotskyists began to issue Socialist Appeal in New York as an 8-page tabloid weekly. Soon afterward, they established a, quote, national committee of the expelled branches, end quote. The Trotskyists also organized their version of a convention of the Socialist Party youth group, the Young People's Socialist League, in September 1937. Ernest Erber, who had been chairman of the YPSL, when it was associated with the Socialist Party, was elected chairman of the Young People's Socialist League Fourth International. Hal Draper, as a, quote, native, end quote, socialist, was chosen as a national secretary of the new YPSL. Some ex-Clarityite Yipsels, such as Irving Howe and Herman Benson, did not join the Trotskyists until shortly before the September convention of the YPSL. Finally, the National Committee of Expelled Branches called a national convention to meet in Chicago on December 31st, 1937 to January 1st, 1938. Cannon noted that the National Committee's work, in the meanwhile, had been done, quote, under the closest cooperation and even under the supervision of Comrade Trotsky, end quote. He added that, quote, in the midst of all his troubles and the preparation of all his material on the Moscow trial, Trotsky had time to write us frequently and to show that he had a very close and sensitive understanding of our problem. Trotsky did everything he could to help us, end quote. Cannon. The founding convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in Chicago put an end to the U.S. experiment with the French term. In retrospect, Cannon claimed that, quote, our, quote, round trip, end quote, through the Socialist Party had resulted in gains all along the line. We formed the Socialist Workers' Party in Chicago on New Year's Day and began once again on an independent struggle with good prospects and good hopes, end quote. James P. Cannon. Thanks for listening.